Have you ever wondered why certain things in the Bible turned out the way they did? There's some strange things in Scripture. And if we just look at them, we can say, oh, that's interesting. And if we turn away, we get nothing out of it. The classic example. Why was it, after seeing Jehovah God's support in so many marvellous, miraculous ways, why was it that the Israelites turned away from Jehovah? Remember what they saw? The plagues. Going through the Red Sea. Imagine seeing a sea split in front of us and two great big huge walls of congealed water on either side as we went through. I wonder what congealed water looks like. I wonder if they ran up to it and stuck their hand in it and took a squidge around. What if you could see through it and see the fishes going along? Don't know. But if you saw it, would you ever forget that? Never. And then, of course, the way that Jehovah God cared for them miraculously and then ushered them in to the promised land. And that was just the beginning. For centuries, Jehovah God showed his strong arm. Miracles were not everyday occurrences, but they weren't rare amongst Jehovah's people. He kept standing in and looking after them. It's stunning. And yet, as we said, they left Jehovah God. Why? Some might say it was because they were wicked. Well, that's a very easy, dismissive answer. If you'd like to find a little clue as to why quite likely the Israelites went so bad, open the Bible to Exodus chapter 34 and we'll look at this together. Exodus chapter 34, and we're going to focus our attention on a little statement that is made that we have to say initially it might sound very odd. And we want to stress before we read it that we have said we might find a clue as to why the Israelites went so bad. It's in verse 26. Where it states, the best of the first ripe fruits of your soil you are to bring to the house of Jehovah your God. And then it adds, you must not boil a kid in its mother's milk. What a strange little phrase. You must not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Used twice in the Bible. Peculiar, isn't it? What does it mean? Hands up, we don't know exactly. That was very good. That's what I call keen. I've never seen that before. A little later, Malcolm. If we're not exactly certain, it could have been that Jehovah God was stressing there's a natural order of things. Why was it that Jehovah God gave a mother milk? Well, it wasn't to boil the kid in, was it? It was to nurture that little goat. And he didn't want ones going against that arrangement. It could be that that's what Jehovah God meant. However, recent archaeological discoveries cast a different light on this. And to understand why we say this could well be giving us a clue as to why the Israelites went so bad after seeing Jehovah God's support in their behalf, we've got to understand what possibly this could mean. It fits in with other information that we know for an absolute certainty. To understand it, we've got to go back to the nation of Israel just when they've moved into the promised land. And we might read the account and think, oh, it was stunning, marvellous, no concerns at all. But that's not the case. When they went into the promised land, they had certain skill shortages amongst that nation. And those skill shortages would have raised certain questions. For example, let's ask a question. They didn't have a cobbler amongst them. Does anybody know why not? Why didn't they have any shoemakers amongst them at that time? Oh, our sister, right down the front.
while they were in the wilderness, their shoes never wore out.
Now that would have made all the males happy. And no doubt the females too. Their shoes didn't wear out. Jehovah God did something miraculous to them. They didn't wear out. Imagine that. So they lost all the skills necessary to make shoes. So when they went into the promised land, not a cobbler amongst them. Now, that's not such a serious thing, though, is it? Because you can survive without nice shoes. At the skill shortages, they didn't have anyone who could make clothes. Why not? Our young brother Lewis. Oh, it's got to be over the microphone, Lewis. You can make yourself a hero now if you get this right. If you get it wrong...
Because the clothes didn't wear out.
You're right. Well done. Well done. Their clothes didn't wear out. So they wouldn't have had to keep making clothes. Spinning fibres and making cloth and things like that. They wouldn't have needed all those skills, so they lost them when they were in the wilderness. But as we said, you can do without nice shoes, you can do without nice clothes. And everybody was in the same position. If someone looked at us as an Israelite as we went into the promised land and thought, what on earth are you wearing? We could have turned around and said, what are you wearing? Because they were in the same situation, weren't they? All right. So you can survive without nice clothes, nice shoes, but there was one skill shortage that would have been a very serious concern to those ones back there. Where did the Israelites get their food when they were in the wilderness? What was that provision that was given? Brother Yarrell, right at the back on the sound desk there.
It was manna, bread from heaven.
Manna. What a miraculous thing that was. Remember, it just sort of appeared there on the ground. And the first time they saw it, they said, what's that? What's that? And they probably had a little flick around. I don't know what that is. What's that? And because they'd never seen it before, do you know what they called it? They called it, what's that? Because that's what the word manna means. It means, what's that? But it was a marvellous thing. And Jehovah God fed them. But as soon as they went into the promised land, it stopped. Now there's the problem. If they've survived as a nation on manna for all that period, what skills would they have lost? The skills to farm. There wasn't a farmer amongst them when they went into the promised land. Now you can do without shoes, you can do without nice clothes, but you can't do without food. And there must have been a concern in some minds when they went in. But it wasn't a great concern when you consider what Jehovah God had already told them. Let's open our Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 11. Now, there are two reasons why we say it wasn't such a great concern, although it does raise a question, doesn't it? Now, the first reason is brought to our attention at the end of verse 9, where in describing the land to which he was taking his people, he said, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. Look at it carefully. There's more in that old phrase than we might think. Did you notice what he did not say? He didn't say it's a land with the potential to flow with milk and honey. He said it's already flowing with milk and honey. Although the Israelites were not skilled agriculturalists, Jehovah God had allowed the Canaanites, who were very skilled farmers, to live in that land. And so the Canaanites had done all the hard work. They turned the barren ground, if you like, whatever the ground was like, into beautiful farms. They planted it. And Jehovah God had arranged matters so that when the Israelites moved in, they moved into farms with fruit on the vine. And Jehovah said, you're my people. Just move in and take over. It's yours. They're only squatters. It's your land. Imagine that. That would have been a comfort, wouldn't it? Originally, they went into a land that was already farmed and looked after. That's the first reason why the fact that none of them were farmers was a major concern. But there's more. Look at from verse 10, where it says, for the land to which you were going to take possession of it is not like the land of Egypt out of which you came, where you used to sow your seed and you had to do irrigating with your foot, like a garden of vegetables. But The land to which you are crossing to take possession of it is a land of mountains and valley plains. Of the rain of the heavens it drinks water. A land that Jehovah your God is caring for. The eyes of Jehovah your God are constantly upon it, from the beginning of the year to the close of the year. And when they heard that, the Israelites would have gone, oh, that's good news. Why? It's that little statement that Jehovah uttered there in verse 10. The land to which you are going to take possession of it is not like the land of Egypt. Now, why was that such an important thing to the Israelites? Well, remember, they only would have, as they went into the promised land, known of farming from their ancestors who had farmed in Egypt. And Jehovah wanted to stress it's not like that, it's different. Now, was Jehovah God saying that the land of Egypt was a barren land? No. Because the land in Egypt is fertile around the Nile Delta, but there was something about this land that would have made farming there very difficult. It's flat. Very flat. And it's very hot. And the only part with the water is that bit around the delta itself. So if you wanted to farm back there and be successful, you either had to have a piece of land right next to the Nile, or you had to get the water out of the Nile to where you were farming. Otherwise it all just dried up. And how did they get the water out of the Nile to the places further away from the water itself? Well, we know that they built great big water wheels, and they had to tread on them to suck the water out of the Nile, tip it into these gullies which took the water out of the fields. And it could have been that Jehovah God was saying to the Israelites, you won't have to do that. Did you notice the irrigating with your foot? It could have been that that's what he was saying. However, there's another possible explanation to that little phrase that I find even more disturbing. You see, the Israelites were poor, so their land wasn't next to the Nile, it was a long way away. Yet, although they were farmers, or rather they were herders of sheep, they still had to grow some things. Now, how do you grow things in a barren land? Well, as we said, the ground would have been very flat. If you take your seed and you just throw it on there, it dries up. So what farmers have to do is they have to make these grooves in the ground like that. And you put your seed at the bottom of the groove, and when you do tip your precious water on that, it goes to the bottom of the groove where the seed is, and eventually it grows. It's not brilliant, but it's better than nothing. Now, how do you make grooves in the ground? If you've got a bit of money, you have a plough pulled behind a bull. But the Israelites didn't have any money, they were slaves. So it's quite likely they made grooves in the ground like this. They put their heel in and they dragged it. Can you imagine the pain involved in doing that? That's why Jehovah God stressed to them, the land to which you're going is not like the land of Egypt. All the connotations with regard to farming and growing food would have been painful ones. So Jehovah said, it's not like that. This is a land with mountains and valley plains. The rain comes along, it lands on top of the mountains, it comes down the bottom, it makes these torrent valleys, there's water everywhere, gushing out. And even today, skilled agriculturalists point out that if you want to find a nigh on perfect place to grow things, it's here. All this water in the valleys. It's even got a very unusual thing that takes place here. They have an early rain just when farmers want it, and they have a late rain just when farmers want it, and at the end of the growing seasons. And in between, every night, when your fruit is on the vine, getting succulent and juicy in the sun every day, rolling down off the side of the hills in the early morning, is this heavy dew which stops your fruit from drying out. It's perfect, and Jehovah said, that's the land to which you're going. And I will look after it as long as you follow through on what's said in verse 13 onwards, where it says, and it must occur that if you will without fail obey my commandments, that I am commanding you today, so as to love Jehovah your God and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul, I also shall certainly give rain for your land at its appointed time, autumn rain and spring rain, and you will indeed gather your grain and your sweet wine and your oil. Did you notice the part that the Israelites had to put into the equation to make it work? Be obedient to God. Okay, their farming skills would develop over the years, but Jehovah guaranteed they would have plenty as long as they put him first and were obedient. So there it was, when they went into the promised land, all those concerns, they didn't have to be worried about anything really. Jehovah would look after them. But we said this was a little example to illustrate how things can go so wrong, or as they did go wrong for the Israelites. What went wrong? It was perfect. How did it all go so bad? Well, the Israelites evidently were not content with Jehovah's provisions, so they did something that's very human. And here's the mistake. See if you can spot it. Perhaps they got up one morning and they thought to themselves, right, we're going to go walking out to our field. And that might be the road that they were going to walk down the centre aisle there in the hall. And on this side is their field. And they look at their field as they're walking down it, and they've got cucumbers. They've got watermelons. They've got onion and garlic, because they liked onion and garlic, didn't they? Can you imagine the breath? Let's hope they grew parsley as well. I mean, they're horrendous. But there's their field, this side, and their vegetables are all right. But then they look over this side of the road, and they see their neighbour's field. Cucumbers like that. Watermelons, it would have taken 3 or 4 of them to pick one up. The pungent aroma of the garlic and the onions is everywhere. If that was you, what would you have done? That's your field, they're all right. But your neighbour's obviously a far better farmer than you. What the Israelites did was they went and asked their neighbours for some advice as to how to be a good gardener, how to grow things well, which might sound so innocent. But who were their neighbours? Who hadn't they cleared out of the land? The Canaanites. They'd allowed some of them to exist there. Remember, the Canaanites were very skilled at growing things. So the Israelites went along and said, how do you do it? How do you get your cucumbers like that? The Canaanites said, well, do you put manure on the ground? And the Israelites said, I do that already. Do you hoe around the plants like that? Israelites said, I've done that already. So the Canaanites said, if you want to know the secret as to how to grow giant vegetables, come down to the grove at the bottom of my field tonight, and I'll show you. Sounds innocent, doesn't it? But those Canaanites were strange people. And they thought that to grow a lot of lovely vegetables, you not only had to look after the watering of them, the putting of the manure and the hoeing, you also had to appease the person that they thought owned all the land. And you never guess who that person was. It was a god called Baal. And one of the things that archaeologists have just recently realized that those people did to appease Baal was to boil a kid in its mother's milk. And it would seem that that's where it all started to go very wrong for the Israelites. Did you spot the specific moment they made a mistake? It was when they went to the wrong place for advice. And it was only advice about gardening, but that was the thin end of the wedge that Satan successfully drove between those Israelites who'd seen Jehovah do so much for them and Jehovah himself. Doesn't it raise a question in our minds? Where do we go for advice? Well, we've only got 3 choices. Firstly, we can go to the world for advice. Have you noticed how the world is full of people who will give advice today? So-called experts. There's experts in every field. Psychiatrists, psychologists, marriage counsellors, guidance people, all these different things. You've only got to pick up Bella magazine today. And it's filled with lots of different pieces of advice. Oh, Brother Alan, you're a Bella man, are you? I put you down as a people's friend man. That's a funny thing. But all this advice that's given out, and some people take it. Does the world's advice work? Well, it can't work. If the world's advice worked, there wouldn't be all these problems in the world. All these people who follow this advice, just think of the mess they get in. It's chronic, it's terrible. The world's advice cannot work for 3 reasons. The first one, well, go back to the 1960s, early 1960s, when pregnant ladies went to their doctors and said, I'm suffering from morning sickness. And the doctor said, morning sickness, thing of the past. Here, just take this drug. Now, before we go any further, let's clarify something. Nobody is saying that the mothers who took those drugs were anything but loving people. Nobody's saying that the doctors who handed those drugs over were anything but caring people. Nobody's saying that the scientists who developed those drugs were anything but intelligent people. And on this occasion, we won't even say that those companies who distributed those drugs for massive profit were anything but ethical people. So we've got ethical people, we've got intelligent people, caring people, loving people. The problem was they were all only people. And that drug, thalidomide, basically guaranteed deformities in those little unborn children. What does it highlight? Human beings, no matter what type of person we are, we do not have the ability to look into the future and see the unavoidable eventual outcome of our advice. We don't know when we accept worldly advice if it's going to turn out for our benefit or if it's going to completely ruin our life. How unwise to rely upon it then. That's the first reason we shouldn't go to the world for advice. There's 2 others. Think about this. If there was a large factory in this area with a big chimney in the middle, and the chimney gave out a funny coloured smoke, if we went to the manager of that factory and said, look, be honest with me, I want to buy a house right next to your factory and raise my children in it. They'll be breathing in the smoke that comes out of your chimney every day. Is it safe? At that point, do you think we could expect an honest answer from that man or woman? Wouldn't they be thinking of their profit margins? How many people know that what they are doing is damaging to others? I should think there's a lot more than we realise. Could we expect to get good advice from a world that is inherently dishonest? How many politicians have got into power by holding back information from the people they expect to vote for them? Do you remember the American politician who said, I think it was in 1942, none of our boys are going to go across to Europe and die in another foreign war? And at that moment, he'd already drawn up plans to send American troops to Europe to die in a foreign war. He lied. But that's what the world is like. How unwise, then, to go to it for advice. It's filled with dishonest people. And the third reason we shouldn't go to this world, well, we live in a world where anything goes. And worldly good advice is not sound for us. What if you went to your neighbour one day and said, I want to sell my car, I need as much money for it as possible. Any advice for me? He might say, well, turn the mileometer back. Nobody will know. You might say, well, it's dishonest, isn't it? He could reply, well, only if you're caught. You probably bought a car with a mileometer turned back yourself. Go ahead and do it. You'll double your money. It sounds good advice. We might know that no one ever would realise that we've done it. But remember, we're Christians. Do we not think the God who made the eye can see? or the God who made the ear can hear all these conniving deals gone on in private? Absolutely. By following worldly good advice, we could ruin our relationship with the Creator so easily. 3 reasons. Do not go to the world for advice. So where else can we go? Well, some say, well, I've had my fingers burnt by going to the world, so from now on, I'm only going to rely upon myself. I'm going to give myself advice. Is that wise? No. That's so foolish. Besides the fact that when we give ourselves advice, remember, we can't look into the future and see whether what we're saying we're going to do to ourselves is going to bring us benefit or not. How many of us can be truly objective when making personal decisions? Can get rid of the emotion out of the picture and look at things properly? How many people have made a massive blunder in their life by making an important decision after sitting down for a lovely meal around a little table for 2, perhaps a candle just burning down, the end of a bottle of wine, a musician in the background with a violin, the romance is in the air, the smell of roses, and they've looked across a table and thought to themselves, yes, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with this person. Only to find out later it all went very wrong. And some people, you speak to them and they said, yes, but I had a gut feeling about this person. Don't ever act on gut feelings after eating a heavy meal. It's probably indigestion. Those who act on gut feelings frequently end up with stomach-churning experiences in life. And remember, as Jehovah's people, we can't go back and undo certain things and still have his blessing. We've got to get it right. So we know we can't go to the world, we can't rely upon our own ideas. Where can we go then? Let's open our Bibles to Romans chapter 12. Now, firstly, we're going to stress where we don't go, and then we're going to develop it as to where we do go. Romans chapter 12. And we're going to look at verse 2. Verse 2. And that's where it says, and quit being fashioned after this system of things. Just pause there for a moment. Remember, this system of things will try and give us advice. Don't accept it. That's one way we can prevent ourselves being fashioned by it. Another way is, what's a prevalent attitude in this world today? It's independence. Don't try and be independent and rely upon yourself when it comes to making decisions. We will make errors. It's guaranteed. We're imperfect. So where else can we go? Let's continue reading. He says, but be transformed by making your mind over, that you may prove to yourselves the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Did we notice at the end of that verse it speaks about the will of God? In the context we're using this thought, we can say that's Jehovah's advice. Why accept it, some might say? Well, did you notice it's described there as good, acceptable, perfect? Let's think about those phrases. That's a description of Jehovah's advice. Good. Good. Well, good isn't just the opposite of bad, of course. Although Jehovah's advice obviously is the opposite of bad. But goodness in the scriptures carries the idea of a benevolent act from a loving benefactor to someone he really cares about. Do we have the right to turn to God and demand that he tell us which course to take? No. We've got no right to demand anything from Jehovah, but he still gives us that advice. Because he really loves us. Hasn't he proven that by sending his son to die an agonizing death to give us here in this room the opportunity of life? Who in the world gives us that? No one. Jehovah's advice should be followed because it comes from someone who's good and he loves us. That's the first thing. But there's more. He also said it's acceptable. Acceptable. Unusual phrase, acceptable. Have we ever heard of the term a poison chalice? In medieval times, they made very heavy metal cups, precious metals studded with jewels and gems. Now, if someone handed you a cup of wine in a chalice that was beautiful like that, our natural inclination would be to assume that the wine inside would be the very best. But a poison chalice looks one thing on the outside, but inside, if we drink from it, it'll kill. An example of a poison chalice? How many decades did the advertising industry say, smoke these cigarettes, people will think you're sophisticated? That's a poison chalice. They'll think that you're like a cowboy out on the American plains, striding out, a real man, a hero. People who drank from that chalice found out frequently too late it was poisonous. That never happens with God. He never gives out advice like that. No human being has ever suffered because of following Jehovah's advice. Satan sometimes brings difficulties upon us for doing so, yes, but Jehovah God said he will undo those problems. The universal sovereign, is there anything that he cannot undo? Everyone who takes Jehovah God's advice finds it most acceptable. Why? Well, he called it perfect there. When Jehovah God gives advice, he's not guessing. He's not saying, well, look, I'm pretty certain that if you follow this course of action, it'll turn out well for you. He never says that. He is 100% certain that if we do this, we'll get blessings. He guarantees it. He controls things to bring about the accomplishment of his purpose, and if we fit into it by accepting his advice, no matter where we start off from, Jehovah God will take us to true happiness. Can we see why it's so wise not to follow the world's, not to look to ourselves, but to follow God's advice? So when decisions come up in our life, and let's be honest about it, decisions come up every day. What must we do? Well, let's just turn forward in our Bibles to Ephesians chapter 5. Just to stress what we must do when decisions come our way. Ephesians chapter 5, and we're going to look at verse 10, because we could have misunderstood something already. It's a simple statement. It just says, keep on making sure of what is acceptable to the Lord. That means when decisions come up, we've got to stop and we've got to think, now what does Jehovah God advise me to do in this situation? And we've also got to continually take advantage of Jehovah's provisions so that his advice is put into our minds so that if we have to make a snap decision, it's one based upon scriptural principles that he's taught us. How do we do that? How do we keep on making sure what is acceptable to Jehovah? We've got to study. You know, there's a funny story going around about this book. Some people think it's a sort of a lucky charm. If you hold it tightly enough, then you get the information out of it and it just falls in somehow. It's a nonsense. We have to study the Bible. May I just address our younger brothers and sisters, not to the exclusion of others, but could I emphasize to you, make the truth your own. Don't accept your parents' statements. Find out from your own Bible study whether this is true or not. Because if it is true and you've worked that out in your own mind and you follow Jehovah God's guidance, you will be happy. If you're not convinced that this is true, because you haven't studied it yourself, you haven't asked questions and then gone and found out what the answer is, you'll be half-hearted in this organisation forever and you won't get a thing out of it. Your parents will have to drag you to the meetings and it will be misery. And in the end, you're about 6'4", and you say, you're not dragging me anymore. It'll hurt your parents, but it'll hurt you more. Take that as a little bit of advice. Find out for yourself whether this is God's word or not. Do something about it. And do it quick, because time's running out. So can we see we've got to make sure of what these things are. Now, when we come to Christian meetings, of course, the faithful and discreet slave class, they take scriptural principles and they put them into a modern context for us. We can see how we apply certain scriptural statements. And the truth becomes something more real to us. That's why meeting attendance for all of us is an absolute imperative. You cannot dilute that statement. Anybody who misses a meeting will suffer. You can't avoid it. Yeah. And those who can't avoid missing the meetings because of problems, they always say, I suffer from missing the meetings. It's a strange situation. It's painful. But if we can get here, we must come along and allow Jehovah God to educate us so that we know what's acceptable to him. Because every time we go into the world, Satan bombards us, does he not, with his propaganda, and he gets in every nook and cranny if we let him. So we've got to keep on making sure of what is acceptable. We've got to know how the Bible applies in our lives. And is that it? Does that mean once we've got to that point, everything's going to be rosy? No. There's one more step. And sadly, this is the one that some aren't taking. Let's just recap what we've said. Jehovah God has got lots of advice. There isn't a situation that we will come across where God doesn't advise us. The Bible is where we find that advice. But knowing what to do doesn't benefit us at all unless we take the third step. If we move forward in our Bibles to Hebrews chapter 5, we can find out in conclusion what it is. Now, Hebrews chapter 5 should be something that we're most familiar with, because in the last 3 years, Brother Don Holly would have gone through this. He might have gone through it 4 times. So there must be something important here. Otherwise we wouldn't have gone through the same material over and over. It's amazing what we can forget, though. Let's set the scene. Chapter 5 and verse 11. It says, concerning him, that was Jesus Christ, we have much to say and hard to be explained, since you have become dull in your hearing. What do you think? Did Paul pull punches? He said something that was very direct there, because he knew that once he loved, there was a danger. He said he couldn't explain things to them because they'd become dull in their hearing. Once everyone sobered up in the congregation to which he originally wrote this, he then says something else important. Verse 12. For indeed, although you ought to be teachers in view of the time, you again need someone to teach you from the beginning the elementary things of the sacred pronouncements of God. And you become such as need milk, not solid food. For everyone that partakes of milk is unacquainted with the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. What did he mean in verse 12 when he said, in view of the time, you ought to be teachers? Well, do we remember that this was written in the year 61 CE? And the congregation to which he wrote these things was the one in Jerusalem, not a little backwater. This was number one congregation. This was the congregation the apostles had gone to. Christ's family had been there. They had a spiritual heritage second to none. But he still said, you ought to be teachers in view of the time. 61 CE was when he wrote this. 33 CE was when the congregation was established. That's 28 years. He was saying in view of 28 years of being in the truth, you should have moved on to be teachers by now. So there's something amiss. Then he used that example. Milk. You need milk. You've got a mothers and babies room somewhere in this Kingdom Hall, have you not? Where is it? Is it there? That's very good. What would you think if all of a sudden a mother stood up, grasped hold of the hand of a 28-year-old and took them into the mothers and babies room? We'd think there's something amiss there, wouldn't we? Because you cannot just keep taking in milk. In a physical sense, it is wrong. In a spiritual sense, it's wrong too. We have to move on to the deeper things and a true, clearer understanding. We've got to mature. Now, why was it that some of these ones had been going along to the congregation there for 28 years and they hadn't matured? Well, do remember, this was the congregation to which Paul said, don't forsake the gathering of yourselves together. Some had been doing that. They hadn't been at every meeting. You can't mature unless you take in all the material that Jehovah gives. But there was another reason, and this is the point we want to highlight. With regard to all the advice that was given out back then to that congregation, why was it that some hadn't matured? Why was it that some were still making, shall we say, childish mistakes and decisions? Verse 14 contains a big answer. He said, but solid food belongs to mature people, and then note, to those who through use have their perceptive powers trained to distinguish both right and wrong. Did you notice that thought? It's through use. How easy it is to sit in a kingdom hall and listen to Jehovah God's advice and nod in agreement and then walk out and do the complete opposite. It is so, because we're human beings. But it's only when we put Jehovah God's advice into use that we become mature Christians. It's almost as if we're digesting it and then using its nutrients to act in a particular way. That's when we benefit. And we would urge everyone to put Jehovah's advice to use. Because when we do, something happens inside of us that can protect us. Paul alluded to it at the end of verse 14, when he spoke about those who through use have their perceptive powers trained to distinguish both right and wrong. If we've got the reference Bible on our lap, no doubt we recall he said perceptive powers trained like a gymnast. Have you ever seen a gymnast on a beam? 4 inches wide, and they do this. No, I won't do one tonight. It's a low ceiling, you see. But they do all these amazing somersaults and twisting, and then they land back on the beam. And they keep perfect physical balance. How can they do it? They've trained their physical powers to be balanced. When they get up on that beam initially, they might find that they're leaning right over and things like that, just to keep balance. But after a while, they train their sensory organs to be so sensitive that the slightest movement to one side, which could eventually lead to their losing their balance, they immediately counter it. Slightest movement to this side, they immediately counter it. And in the end, it's so immediate. Their movements are so small, it looks as if they're having no problems doing it at all. They've trained themselves to keep physical balance. Paul said, if we put Jehovah God's advice to use, we can train ourselves to do that in a spiritual sense, so we don't lose our spiritual balance and fall off the beam. Someone who has put Jehovah's advice to use has it in their mind, and whenever decisions come up, they constantly raise questions. For example, if I watch this television program, will it send out the signal that I like the filthy, smutty entertainment of this world, or I want to stay a Christian witness of Jehovah? If I sign this mortgage agreement, will it rob me of all the time I need to put Jehovah God first in my life? If I sign this hire purchase agreement, will it take so much time out of my existence just to pay for these things that really my worship of God will become secondary? If I groom myself or dress myself this way, will it limit what I can be used for in the congregation? We can go on and on and on. But that is what a mature person does. So can we urge everybody to take this piece of material to heart? Because if we do act wisely, we're going to benefit. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that decisions don't matter, that we can follow any course of action with impunity. Not even little decisions. Remember the Israelites. They lost Jehovah God's favour because they went to the wrong place for advice about gardening. We can lose everything too if we're not careful. But rest assured, if we come along to the meetings and if we put Jehovah God's advice into practice in little things, he will help us to develop our balance, so that even though Satan is shaking the beam like never before, we'll stay upright, because he's trained us to distinguish right from wrong. Well, that concludes the material we're going to look at this evening. And I certainly hope there's something there that's got our mind working. Wise decisions made now will bring us blessings forever. Well, we've got a beautiful song to conclude the meeting with. It's song number 2, which ties in rather well with the material we've considered. It's entitled Obeying God Rather Than Men. So let's think again about the lyrics in this song and be determined to put these things and the advice given into practice.